You all think you know what you want to do? Yeah, they're probably... Okay. So, for myself, I went directly into a program in landscape architecture. And it was a good degree. I enjoyed it. But by my junior year, I pretty much decided that I didn't want to be a landscape architect. And it was a professional type school, so all the courses were geared to train you to do that. So I figured out what was the absolute minimum I needed to take in order to graduate with that degree. And then I just took a bunch of other classes to find out what else was going on at the university, which was probably a really useful thing. So when I graduated, I did a lot of different things. I went and hiked the Pacific Crest Trail, and I worked for the Forest Service, and I drove across up Alpine Meadows, and I worked construction, and traveled. And it took me about 9 years after I graduated to then figure out what I wanted to do, and then go to graduate school and pursue that. And it was after a job, 3 years with a conservation corps, where I was working with folks that had graduated from high school but were not in college. They were 19 through 24, and they were not college bound, and they were trying to develop job skills. And so this was a conservation corps where one of the things was to develop job skills, but we happened to work in the areas of the environment. So we were doing flood control, we were doing fire control, we were building trails, these kinds of things. And I really liked that particular age group, and I really liked kind of the environmental education component of that. And that's what finally pushed me to then go back for a degree, a graduate degree, and I went into geography. Now, when I say the word geography, tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. Geography? Maps, right? Okay. Do you know anything else about geography other than maps? Culture? What was that? Land? What else? By association or anything? How old were you when you last had a geography? Can you even remember having had geography?
5th grade. Probably 5th.
It is
Maybe freshman? Okay.
the black hole of disciplines in this country, right? Because normally you get it, I think, in 3rd grade or 4th grade, right? And you do maps, and then maybe you do maps. I'm not sure what else they did. But it turns out to be a really nice intersection of disciplines if, in fact, you're interested in the environment and you're also interested in people or culture. Okay? Because the study of geography is looking at the interaction of people and place. And so I was more interested in kind of the environmental side, but I was really interested in how humans use that environment. And so, by doing this conservation core thing, I realized I didn't want to go into just straight up ecology. I didn't want to go into biology, and so I went back for geography. And I was interested in how environmental history, essentially, how places get to be the way they are. And so I went back and I did a master's degree, and then I went straight on and did a PhD because I was really interested in teaching at a university. And if you want to punch that ticket, that's what it takes. Right? So if you want to teach at a university, 6-7 years more of education after your 4 years of master's. Okay? And your salary will probably be less than your colleagues when you start. We didn't do that. So you only do that if that's in fact what you really want to do. And there's no better way to figure that out than to do a master's, because a master's is kind of like training wheels for a PhD. And you shouldn't even think about graduate school when you're going into undergraduate. If anything, what I would tell folks is explore as as much as you can in your undergraduate days, and then take some time off and figure things out. But that's just cheap advice. So what I ended up doing was this work in what I call paleoecology, reconstructing the past. Okay? And so what I do is I take mud out of lakes, and then I analyze that to try and figure out forest change, vegetation change, and climate change. And I work in all kinds of environments. I've worked out on Pyramid Lake. I've worked in little ponds out in the middle of Nevada. I've worked on even smaller ponds out in the middle of Nevada where you'd think that there's no water. Because to do the kind of work I do, there has to be some kind of standing water. Because that's when things from the environment then collect and accumulate. And so it's like a little carrying basket that's been sitting there as long as the lake's been there. And so as long as it's there, it doesn't know it, but it's passively collecting everything that might fall in. And as long as it's preserved, then we can pull it out and analyze it and read natural history. I've worked in meadows, in wilderness areas. Sometimes we need to have pack animals to get us into where we're going because it's a lot of heavy equipment. Okay? We set up these little platforms to work on. It's all little kind of dinky stuff. It doesn't take a lot. This is plywood 2x4 that we just built ourselves and bolted together. But you can get extraordinary results. And then you core these meadows. Okay? So I brought in my stuff so that you can just kind of see what the tools are of my particular trade. Okay, so this is what I use. This is where all my research starts. This is called a Livingston square rod corer, and my dear graduate students use the whole roll of tape. Okay. So the way this thing works is, there's a rod that comes up out of this thing, and it sits in place, okay? And then, we take this thing, and there's a piston inside. I should show you what that piston looks like. Inside. Okay? It's in this tube. So that when this thing gets in place, we're standing up on the surface. This cable, and this goes down into the water, okay? This cable then gets held tight. It's attached this piston. Okay? We take this thing and then we push it into the mud. And as we do that, the piston, which is held in place because it's attached to this cable, which is taped up. And that pulls up. Piston eventually rides up into this, and the barrel fills with mud. What's the purpose of the piston? What's the piston? Because that sits in there while the thing fills with mud. It's not exactly pressure, but it's along those lines. Suction creates a vacuum. Okay? So it creates a vacuum so that what doesn't happen? So the mud doesn't fall out. So when we get up to the top, this thing's full of mud. The piston is at the inside. It's rinsed up to here. Right? So I can pull the whole thing, which is probably not going to work because it's dry. But the piston can ride all the way up. Then we turn this thing around, flip it back over. On the deck. Push and then we'll come down. Okay? So, this tool doesn't cost that much. Very simple. You can carry it around. Once you get that 1 meter out, then you go right back down the same hole. Okay? And I've been able to go down. About the longest core I've ever pulled out so far is 20 meters. Probably about from here to the back of the room. The mud going straight down. Just using this, it's all hand operated, okay? So often, if we're working on lakes, we've built ourselves a little float, and we push down through using that. It's all hand work. It's, here you can see the thing coming up with the mud on it. We're kind of cleaning it off. This is why I have students. This is you someday. Okay? Things break. It's a lot of pressure, you know. We get to know our mechanics and the machine shop really well. And then here it's coming out. And then we out. Okay? And so we wrap them up so that they're ready to go back to them. So that it's not just some kind of abstract thing. I brought in 3 cores for us to go open up and look at. So let's move over here. So the thing about the cores is that you'll take the caps off the ends, unwrap them, undo the tape or cut the tape. They're in nice halves. They can split open. Okay? But the thing is, when you pull something up out of the mud, it's the first time you get a chance to see it. Look and see. And so let's see what's in these things and what we can see.
I know, but it is, you're still floating, right? So
You don't move.
Yeah.
You set the anchors out and pull them up tight so that you don't move it. Yeah. Okay. So, you can tell from the bottom. And it should have been labeled here with a T, and that one should be labeled with a B. Right? And then there's a little dimple here where that piston was. Okay? And so if you look down here, you can take samples of this and you can feel it. Okay? And you can feel, and you can see what the differences are. What do you notice when you look at this? Or take a feel on it, right? There's paper towels back there. We can clean up. What's it feel like? You feel changes? So if you want to do this, take a little kind of piece off with your thumb, run it between your fingers, and see if you can find differences here. And you can move and you can look at one versus another and see if there's many differences. Okay, so what do you notice when you look at this? Is it consistently black? How do you know? There's a very clear change here, isn't there? Right? What is up? The top is kind of rolling. What changed? We don't know what changed though, do we? That's what we have to figure out. All we know is that clearly there was something going on here and then something here. There you go. When you look at this, what do you see here versus here? And which is the top of this anyway? How do you know? Perfect. So this came first, right? And then this came second. Okay? So this was happening. How do they look different from each other? It's darker. You can feel this stuff too, right? You can take a little pull with your thumb or something and feel that versus feel this. There's a really distinct difference. What do you feel?
This one's dry.
Well, they're all kind of wet and they're all kind of dry, but when you rub it, which is grittier? Yes, the lighter. And when you say gritty, what are you actually thinking about?
Sand.
More sand. And what's in the other one? Well, we're up in the mountains in this case. We know where we are. We're in the Golden Trout Wilderness. We're in the Sierra Nevada. Okay, so maybe this was a period when the meadow was growing really well, and this was a dry period when there was no. We know that the present is at the top. We use a variety of methods to date them. And every one of these layers that's in here is a piece of information of environmental change. In addition, then, we go through and we analyze the cores for all kinds of other different fossils and chemicals that collect in these cores. And I'm going to focus on, so here we are. You love your job. I love these cores. Right? And I look at this and I say, wow, a lot happened here, and we're going to figure out what it is. So, primarily what I do is I reconstruct vegetation history and climate history and fire history. Because when a fire burns, the smoke that you see in the air is actually tiny pieces of charcoal. And those collect in lakes, and we can preserve those and we can count them. We can quantify the amount of fire. Or pollen. Okay? Now pollen is kind of a beautiful thing. So we'll meet some pollen because all plants produce pollen. Some much more than others. So that some plants are wind pollinated, so that they have little dangly flowers, and when the wind comes, it blows this pollen, and they produce billions. And in a couple of weeks, you'll begin noticing this.
Never good to have a dress like that.
And you'll have yellow. Have you seen the yellow windshields? So what's that? From what? Most is pine when you get that much yellow, because pine's just pretty huge amount of pollen. Okay? And in fact, this is the pollen of a pine. And so pollen is coming off of all of these different plants. So you can imagine, so every year, there's a whole spectrum of plants in the environment, and they're producing pollen, and some of them produce huge volumes that blow around. And a lot of that stuff that blows around falls in the lake. And when it falls in the lake, it settles down to the bottom, and it sits there. And then the next year, the plants bloom, and they produce a whole bunch of pollen, and it blows around, and it comes, some of it lands on the lake, and it floats down, and it sits on top of the other pollen. And this happens year after year after year. So if you have thousands of years of this, you can go in and you can take small samples of that mud in slices from the bottom all the way to the top. You can digest the sediments using chemicals to remove all of the non-pollen, and what's left is a rich concentration of pollen, and then if you use a microscope, you can identify them, and you can see how things change over time, and essentially write the history of forest change, which is often associated with changes in climate. To do that, what you're always looking at.
So you say that this pollen comes out of the air, is that like
Now, you can be, but mostly what we use is radiocarbon. Okay? So every living thing has carbon, right? That's mostly what we're made of. If you bought a person on the drugstore shelf, you'd be mostly buying carbon. You get some hydrogen and oxygen from wet water, and a little bit of calcium and a few other things. We're not made of something old in the other. But we're mostly made of carbon. You get that carbon by eating plants. But most of us all get our carbon from eating plants. And that carbon is absorbed into the plant from out of the atmosphere. And in the atmosphere, the atmosphere is mostly nitrogen. But it turns out that when nitrogen gets bombarded by cosmic rays, that actually those particles go, those molecules split, and they lose a couple of the protons or neutrons, I can't remember which, and they then form an isotope of carbon, carbon-14, which is an isotope that is it's a radioisotope, so it decays with time. And as long as you're living and eating, you're getting some of that carbon-14. But as soon as you die, or a plant dies, or an animal dies, it stops taking that in. And all the carbon in it starts to decay. And so we can take these dead things, whether it's a person, or whether it's a cat, or whether it's a tree or a pine cone, and you can measure how much carbon is left, and that tells you pretty much how much. So that's the method we use for kind of getting things going. Yes. When something has decayed for about 40,000, 45,000 years, it's sufficiently gone that it's immeasurable. So that method is only good for about the last 40,000 years. And then you have to go to other methods.
Hey Scott, when someone asks a question, can you repeat it? Because we can't hear everyone's question.
The first question was how do we age them when we
Okay.
use radiocarbon?
Right.
And the second was, is there a limit to radiocarbon? And the answer is yes, 40 to 45,000 years. That's when it's essentially gone. So this is what a pine looks like. And here's the reason why I'm showing you this. I'm just showing you kind of some of the different types, because after this, then we're going to go to the little microscopes over there, and I've brought in a number of different slides that have different pollen types so that you can kind of look and see what it looks like, what our kind of results would look like. So pine has this body to it, and then it has these bladders hanging off of it. And these help it, its buoyancy, so it blows around, because essentially this stuff wants to float, because this is looking for a flower, it's looking for a female, so that it can pollinate it and produce seeds. Okay? And so that's its job. This is essentially plant sex. Okay? This is for a sagebrush, what that pollen looks like. And so they all have kind of distinct shapes, and they'll have kind of distinct walls and kind of distinct surfaces. And so when you look at this, you're kind of doing shape recognition and size recognition and texture recognition. And so it's very visual. This is one that comes in this family that's very common out in the deserts here. And it looks kind of like a wiffle ball with little holes in it. And we wish we could tell exactly what it is, but most of the time, all we can say is it's one of these types of plants. Okay? But thankfully, all of those plants are ecologically comparable, so we know if we find this, there's a desert there. That's useful. And then there's grasses. And unfortunately, grass produces a lot of pollen, but every grass pollen looks the same. So all we can say is it was a pretty open place with a lot of grass. And then some of these are little things that are representative of trees, like junipers that are here in Nevada. And the pollen of this one looks actually really similar to the pollen of a giant sequoia. So sometimes you can only use your information if you know a little bit about what the ecology is in the area. And so they have holes in them that we call pores. Sometimes they have one, sometimes they have three, sometimes they have many. Like all sciences, there's a whole bunch of terminology that goes along with this, so that philologists can have a conversation with each other so that nobody knows what they're talking about. And sometimes the surfaces look really different. So some of them are really spiny, and others of them are really smooth. We take the sediments, we've got a fume hood, we process them, we make slides, and then we train ourselves on a reference material of something we know, so that when we look at something that's not labeled, i.e. the sediment, the pollen that came out of our sediment, we can identify what's in it.
So, do you have to go to like security to somewhere?
They bring us the books, but it's kind of remarkable. You don't have to put on gloves. They just, you just say with like this, with like that. They bring it out, and they're on the table, and because these are pretty valuable manuscripts. And you hear you think that they'll seal it up, and they're just there to use. But in my research, I have collaborators. And I have collaborators that work on volcanoes. I have collaborators that work on geology and paleomagnetism. And in this case, I have collaborators who are archaeologists and historians. And so they are medieval historians and they can read medieval Italian. And they I just say, something really interesting happened at this time. Can you please help go find out what it is? Yeah. Mexico, done research in Mexico. But other than that, you mean for my research? Other than that, pretty much it's all been around the Western United States. Farthest. Well, the earliest date that I work on? I've worked on stuff that's 750,000 years old. But usually I stay in the last 10 to 15,000. Yes, this work is funded by the National Science Foundation. And that's, I've received funding from the National Science Foundation, from the Forest Service, from even Southern Nevada Water Authority for different kinds of projects. But this is the federal funding from the National Science Foundation.
Did I just design a project for you?
Here's how it works. Okay. You come up with a project, okay, and you get 15 pages single-spaced to argue why it should be funded. And attached to that is a budget. And you're not told how much the budget should be, but you talk to different people and you kind of know what's acceptable. Most think projects are for 3 years, and most budgets are between $300 and $500,000. Okay? And that's to support all the people, the travel, the materials. You submit that, and then it's reviewed by 3 to 5 people, scholars who are experts in that somewhere out there, and then they send those in, and then there's a panel, and 2 people on the panel are assigned to also read it, and between reading those judgments and this, they give it a ranking. And depending on how it ranks is whether you get funded. And the success rate is 10 to 12%. So for every 100 that are submitted, 10 or 12 people are funded. So it's extremely competitive.
So,
You use the pennies that you have to keep getting more information. I've been working on this for about 7 years, but I only got funding 2 years ago. So before that, I got a small bit of money here, a small bit of money there, enough money to go over, collect some mud, do some things, generate some results, generate some interest. So you kind of work on a shoestring until you get that, and then you make the most out of that opportunity and try to turn it into the next one.
so what's your main thesis if you go into your project?
The main thesis is that we will be able to reconstruct high-resolution climate, environmental change, and compare that against historical documents so that we can develop a rich understanding of cause and effect in relation to those environmental changes. Often we assume that the climate change and the environment change, and we take people out of the equation. So our goal is to try and put people directly into the equation and see from the documents, do we say this environmental change was happening, was directly caused by people because of a disease, or because of a war, or because of a change in the social structure. This was caused by climate. So we're trying to disentangle the cause and effect. And then, where we know that climate was the cause, then I really want to look at what was the response of the people. Because if climate change creates a drought here, the question is, how are we going to respond? And I want to find examples in the past of communities that really have this. I do to a certain extent, but most paleobotanists work with actual fossils, and actual fossils tend to be much older in time. So I have done some work on that, like with oaks in California, where we were working on fossils that were 10 to 15 million years old. The time periods I'm working don't produce those kind of fossils, which is why we call this fossil pollen, because the fossil pollen is actually dead. Yeah, I'm always hoping I'm going to find a Roman coin with Caesar's image on it, so that I'll know that I'm right there in the Roman period. I have never found one. I've never found a fossil. It's about all I ever get out of these is money. Maybe if I'm lucky with money. Any questions about the university or graduate school or those kind of things?
So they pay you to go to graduate school?
They should. And I think that that's a good strategy.
Yes.
Go to the school that pays you.
Yes.
Because you're there for a while. So sometimes I got paid by being a teaching assistant so that I helped teach courses. Sometimes I got fellowships. In a few cases I wrote grants and I put my salary into the grant. But I was paid every semester while I was in graduate school. I was in graduate school. It took me 2.5 years to get my master's and another 5 years for the PhD. So it took 7.5. I guess it would have been 8 years total because by the time I was out. And I was funded the whole time. And I highly recommend that if you go to graduate school that you let that pay for you.
It's cheap labor.
Actually, all three of my degrees were from the University of California, Berkeley. I live in California. I was born and raised in California, and I was from the Bay Area, so it was easy to go to Berkeley as a graduate school. It was a lot easier to get in there. I would have gotten it. And then, because we had family at the time, I applied to 3 different graduate schools around the country: Berkeley, Boulder in Colorado, and Wisconsin, in Madison. I got into all 3, but again, because of, well, one, because financially it was going to be a little easier to go to Berkeley, but 2, I went to each of those schools and I interviewed with the faculty and the students, and I actually liked the students best at Berkeley because I was older. I was 30 years old when I went back to graduate school, and most of the other students were older, and I felt more comfortable with that population. They just had more experience, they were a little more mature, and some of them I just didn't like the students. Because in fact, you get, I think, as much education from your colleagues as you do from your professors. Yeah. I love Berkeley. Go there. Berkeley's a great place. I think it's better for graduate school than undergraduate. It's a big, there's 30,000 students, so you have to be pretty aggressive as an undergraduate to get what you want. It's tough. But I wasn't a very good undergraduate student either. I was good enough to get into graduate school, thank goodness. But I probably could have gotten. I think sometimes you can even get a better experience at a smaller school where classes are a little smaller, you have a little more contact with your professors and stuff. Don't get me wrong, it's a great school, and you would probably do really really well because you would have great students around you pushing you, more than great interactions with faculty. There are other places where you might have better interactions with faculty. That's just one opinion, but that's my opinion. Yeah.
So, when you do your PhD, do they have you doing coursework along with your research?
Yes. At this university, you have to take an additional 24 credits of courses. Okay? And then 24 credits of essentially you have to take about 8 courses and then you go into the dissertation.
So those are like really high level.
Those are graduate seminars, okay? And so they're only graduate students, and they are extremely focused. It's a very different kind of education. It's as much self-education as it is. They're not lectures in most cases. They're usually readings and discussion and. Yeah.
You were saying that like you were paid to go to graduate school and everything. Is that,
Well, let's put it this way. I got some money.
Yes.
but is there like a way to do that by going to medical school too? Can that same sort of thing happen?
I think from what I hear, medical schools are sufficiently competitive that they don't bother to give you a. You might get a fellowship or something, but it's pretty darn competitive. They're much less inclined to give you money in medical school. So they also figure you're going to come out and get a huge salary, which might be, but maybe you want to go work for Doctors Without Borders and you're not going to get a huge salary. So it's obviously something to look at and consider. But I think it's easier to get funded in general PhD, master's or PhD programs than medical school. Because there are research assistantships for graduate school and there are teaching assistantships. And those don't exist at the same rate in medical school. Okay. Because medical schools are to teach medical students more, whereas the university is to teach undergraduates. And so one of the roles of the graduate students is to help teach the undergraduates. And so they get paid a stipend to do that, and that becomes part of their training if they're going to go on into academia.
Okay.
But because medical school is really a professional school, they will train you to go off into the profession. It's kind of a different structure.
Cameron, if you write that question down, I can look specifically at UNR and tell you the number of people that get funding as a med student. I can look at that. It's probably pretty small.
It's very small. There's some scholarships.
Scholarships or fellowships
Yeah.
and stuff.
Yeah. 'Cause
I had no idea about this when I started. It would have never occurred to me. Even when I went to graduate school, this was not on my mind. I knew I was interested in kind of environmental history, but I wanted to go study deforestation. And my first intent for master's work was to go study issues of deforestation in the Himalayan Nepal, because I recently traveled in that area, and I knew that there was a lot of interest in this. And so I studied Hindi for 2 years to prepare to go over, and I took all kinds of classes kind of on Central Asia, as well as forest history. And then I took a graduate level course with the faculty member on campus who worked with most of the graduate students that went and did these kind of projects. And we were like oil and water. When he spoke, I couldn't understand it. And when I spoke, he didn't think anything I said made sense. And so much of your graduate education is a mentoring with an individual. And there was no way I was going to go to India or Nepal without some kind of faculty level support and introduction. It just wasn't going to show up. And I knew I wasn't going to get it from him. And so I completely changed my course. And that was already, I was already in graduate school for a year and a half. And I had been working on a master's thesis. I was actually using tree rings to reconstruct kind of the history of oak woodlands because there was some interesting questions about these oaks not regenerating and maybe the trees were all dying and they were going to disappear. And in doing that work, I saw a request for proposals. The request for proposals is the term that's used when a funding agency who wants certain kinds of research done puts out a request that says, this is the kind of thing that we need proposals submitted for. And I looked at it, and it was about oaks in California. And I looked at this proposal, and I said, this proposal, I have all the skills for this, because it's about oaks, which I know about. It's about pollen, and the faculty member I was working with did pollen, and I had studied pollen, so I knew about it. I took a class in pollen, and at the end of that class, I said, never going to do this again. But I looked at this interesting request for proposals, and I said, that is a question that can be answered with pollen. And I knew how to do that, and so I wrote the proposal with another colleague, and we got funded, and that paid for the rest of my graduate school. During that time, I got much better with the pollen, and I learned what I was doing, and I realized the kinds of questions I could answer with it. And I've been doing it ever since. And at this point, I'm happy as complete. Because I like it. But until that point, and I was already well into my graduate school, I had no clue that I was not moving in this direction.
These are the cool stories.
So you can be clueless for a long time.